into the last, fourth of the course, looking at the last stages of development. Today we're going to begin to take a look at middle adulthood, and then right before the break, we'll take a look at later adulthood, and then we'll actually end with a couple of sessions looking at some issues around death and dying as well. So that's kind of where we're kind of moving to and through. It's kind of interesting as we look at development through the life cycle. We've kind of, when we began again with conception, and we kind of looked at what often is kind of just a gradual kind of evolution, a progression forward, again physically, socially, emotionally, and cognitively. And then as we hit a certain place in adulthood, we begin to see a gradual evolution in some areas of development backwards in the other direction, almost kind of coming full circle, with, again, a lot of the social factors impacting the extent to which the rate and speed of which those developmental changes occur. Middle adulthood is a stage that I've become more and more interested in, simply because it's kind of the stage of life that I'm in. I always find it interesting when I ask, depending upon the age group of the group I ask, at what age does middle adulthood start, do you think? If you had to pick an age, what would it be? 40? Okay. Anyone else would have a different age at which middle adulthood started? There's no right or wrong on this one, necessarily. What's that? 45? Okay. And you actually have been relatively kind in some cases. What do you think happens the younger the audience that you ask? The younger the age tends to be. If you ask, again, high school kids when middle adulthood starts, it's not uncommon for them. I've actually had some college students that talked about middle adulthood starting at 30 or 35. What tends to happen is you get closer to whatever that age is. What do you tend to do in terms of your own perception? Push it back, exactly. When you get those that are in their 30s and you begin to ask them when middle adulthood is, they begin to push it back, further out there. Because again, I think a lot of 40-year-olds have a hard time imaging themselves as being middle adults, But typically, I think a lot of times, again, when we look at the textbook, and a lot of times we often think of 40. Often we look at 40, between 40 and 65 are the point when people, typically, though that's changing as well, retired. And often we thought of retirement as kind of that point marking kind of the ending of middle adulthood and in the beginning of later years. What we find is that middle adulthood is starting later and lasting longer, especially for those who remain healthy and active. Probably what I would suggest is that we often think of 40 kind of marking the beginning of middle adulthood, but I think clearly as people are, again, living longer and as people are living healthier lifestyles, I think what happens is we tend to kind of have almost a transition period in there. And so a lot of times we think of between 40 and 45 kind of being a transition phase towards middle adulthood. Middle adulthood actually, which it kind of implies, middle kind of marks the midpoint of our lives. And so that's part of why we see somewhat changes, or at least perceptional changes, when it starts. If we think of that at the midpoint as people live longer, and we think of that kind of as a halfway point, that does tend to get a little bit later and later. And so I think a lot of people would image, maybe closer to 45 being the start of middle adulthood than 40. And again, as we continue to see life expectancy increasing, people are living longer in their later years. And so that stage is also becoming a longer stage. And many people are either retiring early because they can, or working longer because they want to for a variety of reasons. And so now even with retirement, becomes harder to use retirement as some benchmark for the beginning of that next stage of life. What is society's image of middle adulthood, of middle age, do you think? Think society has an image whatsoever of this stage of life? We're going to talk about that later on, but a lot of times one of the things that first comes to mind when we think about middle adulthood or middle age is midlife crisis. And we're going to save that one because we're going to talk about that. My hope is in some maybe unique kinds of kinds of ways. Think about birthdays, because I think how we celebrate birthdays tends to be somewhat characteristic of somewhat of a societal image. And though it may typically be more in humor, it does tend to be a reflection of, I think, how people often look at middle adulthood. And how is that? Down the hill at 50. And in some cases, even if you look at 40th birthdays, particularly when you get to 50th birthdays, what tends to characterize those birthdays? They wanted to do that for me, and I said I didn't need it. So I didn't do the traditional 50 birthday. But if I had, what probably would have marked that occasion? If you were going to plan a 50th birthday for someone. What's that? Clearly all kinds of images of over the hill and lots of symbol, black balloons, black crepe paper. Again, there tends to be this notion that once you hit 50 particularly, and like I said, you sometimes see that even at 40 in some cases, that everything else is downhill. Your body falls apart, nothing works anymore, life is no longer satisfying, and tends to have a real negative kind of image to it. Now, we're not going to address that today, but later on we're going to talk about what the experience really is like for most people during middle adulthood. And I think what we'll find is it's often very different than the stereotypical images that we have of this stage of life. Once again, looking at very quickly developmental tasks. And again, I don't think these come as a real big surprise. Again, what we're thinking of typically are those that are, again, between 40, 45, going up again, around 65, and that what used to be that kind of typical retirement age. This will not be my experience as a middle-aged adult, but it is most. At the beginning of middle adulthood, your children tend to be what age? If you have children. Yeah, they tend to be, at some point you're probably going to have some children who are probably, if you had more than one child, at least one of those is probably still going to be a teenager, still at home. And then you'll probably have some, again, that are, if not there, are getting pretty close to being, again, launched out of the home towards college. And then again, depending on how many children you have and where you're at in middle adulthood. But in the early stage of middle adulthood, again, it's not uncommon. And again, remember, we're marrying later, which often means we're having children a little bit later. So again, we tend to have teenagers at some point in the home, and that's kind of some of what's going on. Now, if you have your kids really later in life, you can hit middle adulthood and have them at the very beginning of adolescence, rather more towards the end. So one of the developmental tasks is helping teenage children to become happy and responsible adults. Generally speaking, it is during middle adulthood that we will launch our children into young adulthood. And so our hope is that we have prepared them well, and that as they transition into that next phase of their life where indeed they are more independent, more responsible for their lives, that they will be successful and that they'll be happy. We saw this one again with young adulthoods, but it becomes even more, I think, the case of achieving adult social and civic responsibility. And clearly, if you look at many of the school boards, community organizations, those who play key leadership roles, say in their churches, we tend to find a good number of again, middle-aged adults. Those, again, that are somewhere often between 40 and 65 that are serving in those capacities and that are taking significant leadership roles within their communities. We'll talk more about this one later on, but clearly one of the developmental tasks is career achievement. We start our careers, in young adulthood, and then what we're hoping is that by the time we hit middle adulthood that we're successful in those careers, and that we've received a certain level of satisfaction and the goals that we had kind of set, for ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit about more careers later on when we look at particularly around emotional development. This one may seem somewhat insignificant, but really is important, because remember, developmental tasks are the things that we need to accomplish in one stage, in many cases as preparation for the next. And so one of the things that's important is for adults to develop leisure time activities. Now, why would that be a developmental task for middle adults? Again, as you think about it in terms of preparation for the next stage of life. Or may not have focused enough on those. And again, I know a number of individuals who indeed that was their experience, that apart from family and work, that was where their energy and time went to. And they really never had developed or set aside much time for leisure time activities. In fact, I know some individuals who rarely ever took a vacation, rarely took time off from work, And so what's significant about that is they prepare for the next phase of life, which is? Yeah, one of the things that happens is when we think about the next phase in terms of later adulthood, which also is characterized as the vast majority of them moving towards retirement, it has a lot to do with whether they make a successful adjustment to the retirement years. And there are some who find, I get to retirement and now I have all this time, they didn't have before, and simply, literally don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to enjoy leisure time because they never had developed those activities or allowed themselves to partake in those kinds of activities. And literally, I've known some that have gone back to work, because they couldn't figure out what to do. I'm frankly looking forward to that moment. I have developed plenty of leisure time activities. I could retire tomorrow, and I don't know that I would ever get bored, but some don't. And so it is an important developmental task in terms of a preparation for the retirement years, hopefully when they have the time to actually enjoy their leisure, differently. Again, and this one may seem a little bit strange, but really not. And it is a very critical developmental task. Relating to one's spouse as a person. Or what it really is talking about is the changing relationship with spouse. Now, what in the world is this related to, do you think? Any thoughts? Yeah, exactly. One of the things that happens, again, we're going to launch children during this stage of our lives, and one of the things that happens for married couples is that all of a sudden they find that what's in the household now is the two of us. And literally, in order to make a successful transition, they've got to learn, this seems strange, to relate to each other together again. Because what they've come to realize is that so much of their relating together still, prior to kids being launched, focused around children. Conversation focused around children. Activities centered around children. And even though in not realizing that sometimes is even though we have a relationship together, most of it was not focused on us entirely as a couple. Perfect example. All of a sudden, we launched that last kid, they're gone, and now it's just the two of us in the house. And can we establish, in many cases, reestablish us and just us, and then sometimes struggling with what to talk about, and what to do together. When it's just two of us and what we can do together, what we want to do together is probably very different than when kids were home. And a lot of couples have to deal with that during that stage. Excellent example. Again, today we'll begin to talk about this one, but accepting the physiological changes that are taking place. And we won't say a whole lot at this point because, again, a lot of our discussion today is going to focus on a number of these changes. And finally, one of the developmental tasks is adjusting to aging parents. And again, we'll talk more about this a little bit later on when we talk about social development. But again, it is during this stage when, obviously, as they're moving through middle adulthood, their parents are moving through later adulthood. And again, it's learning to deal with the changes that they're going through and the health issues that they're facing and having more and more responsibility for care for those aging parents. And some, not a high percentage, but some will be in the same place, which our family kind of is, and I think will continue to be likely over the next 10 years, is I have had to take on somewhat more responsibility, not a lot at this point, but somewhat more responsibility in terms of some care or helping out my mom and my grandmother who lives with my mother differently after my dad passed away. And I think that will only continue to increase over the next 10 years. But at the same time, my wife and I still have primary care for a child who's in our household. And so we've got care for dependence or increasing dependence on both ends. And so that tends to occur, again, during the middle adult stage and particularly as middle adults get later in that stage, becomes only increasing responsibility, for their parents. And as people live longer, those stages all increase. All right, want to look at, as we've done each stage, look at some aspects of physical development and changes that are taking place. I think, and again, what you may want to do is highlight, underline key terms, key concepts. I think one of the important things to understand about middle adulthood is, again, very much like the changes that we've experienced as we've moved through the earlier stages of life, they tend to be, except with the exception of infancy and maybe adolescence, where there are very dramatic changes, the changes here are gradual. They're not things that tend to occur overnight. They're things that you kind of over time become aware of, but don't tend to become aware of them on a daily basis that much. Again, it goes back to our notion. We really tend to think that once we hit 50 or right around middle adulthood, that everything quits working, falls apart, it's all overnight, and it's all downhill physically, and that's really not the case. There clearly are some changes. But for the most part, they really don't have a dramatic effect on everyday functioning, and most of them there are ways that we can learn to adjust to and compensate for those changes. Overall, most middle-aged adults are in good physical health, particularly compared to the previous generation. And I do think that's true. I think when we look at my generation of middle-aged adults, I think we are considerably much more focused on health. I think we focused on that earlier in our lives, and I think we are physically healthier than my parents' generation was. And I don't think there was quite the same concern about health issues until the health issues occurred in their lives. And I think that's different for this current generation. And for the most part, we are in good physical health. However, health status does become a major concern. It goes beyond just being something that we're aware of. It starts to center differently in terms of actually being concerned about health issues. What are some of the things that brings that about for middle-aged adults? Because it's at this stage when all of a sudden we begin to think about our health differently, focus on it differently. Okay, you're exactly right. One of the things is that we clearly lose our sense of invincibility. And we also begin to get in touch with a different perspective on time. And we'll talk more about that part of it a little bit later. What is it that causes us to shift out of young adulthood into middle adulthood? What causes us to begin to lose that sense of invincibility? And again, it's hard to identify with that because that's not your experience. But think about maybe your parents, or other people who are in their mid-40s, 50s. What tends to happen in their lives that causes them to? Clearly the loss of a parent. And particularly if you lose a parent early in later adulthood. All of a sudden you begin to, and particularly if maybe some of those health concerns started, in the very early stages of maybe later stages of middle adulthood, early stages of later adulthood, all of a sudden you begin to realize, something could happen to me as well. Particularly if all of a sudden you begin to see some patterns within your family, some health-related issues that keep occurring, clearly can have an impact. What else? That's a good example. I think there are a couple of others that start to trigger that concern. And again, I know it's hard because you're not there.
I think a loss of energy overall. If you have to keep up with your kids and you realize, gosh, I can't do all this stuff with you guys.
Yeah, all of a sudden you do get in touch with the fact that you tire easier. You don't have the energy that you once had. Again, I was moving into my 40s when my son was a toddler. And trying to keep up, at 40 with the toddler was real challenging. At 20, that might have been a different experience, and you get in touch with that for sure. And all of a sudden, you realize changes are taking place, without a doubt. What else? Can you think of another example of what would begin to trigger an awareness of that invincibility? And I think one of the things that begins to happen is around you begin to hear about other people close to your age. I mean, and again, all of us can probably think of someone we've heard about, read about, or know about. Again, in their 50s that had a heart attack unexpectedly and died. And if you're 50, what's that cause you to do? Evaluate what you're doing, because all of a sudden, it's one thing to be 25 and hear about someone who's 50 and you say, that's young. But when you're the same age and those things begin to occur around you, it begins to cause you to reevaluate or assess, what your lifestyle is and are you, living the kinds of habits or behaviors that could be an increased risk for you. My dad had, and I don't remember now the age because time eludes me a lot, but I believe he was in his late 40s when he had his first heart attack. My dad had more than one, had several bypass surgeries. And I remember was there at the hospital when the doctor came in after the second one, and said, now, you guys need to be aware, that it would be hard for him to have another one, in terms of being able to, take veins and what they do in terms of the bypasses and those kinds of things. But he had his first one, right when he was in his late 40s, and then he had another one about, another bout with it about 10 years, 10 years later. And so that automatically puts me in high-risk categories, just a result of kind of family history. And so you begin to think about those kinds of things. Talk more about this later when we talk about, the final stage of life. But I lost a sister almost 2 years ago to cancer. And my sister was younger than I was, by 13 months. And so, again, when you lose a sibling, and again, a sibling who's younger than you are, and then shortly after that you lose your dad and you're aware of others, you begin to evaluate and think about life a little bit differently. And again, when you have a relatively young family in terms of children, you get conscious of wanting to make sure you're taking care of yourself and that you're going to be here, to take care of them. So again, I think there are things that are happening that cause, again, middle-aged adults to focus on health issues a little bit differently than when they were young. Cancer is the leading cause of death, followed by heart disease. And again, what you want to do is kind of highlight, underline, because what you're going to find, and you don't want to get confused, these will reverse themselves when we get to later adult. When we get to later adult, we'll find that heart disease is number one, cancer number two. And again, if you think about it, and people that you know that are in your middle adulthoods, and it seems like, and it may be related to our technology and our ability to detect cancer, but I'm amazed at how many people I know who are around my age that are battling different types of cancer. And like I said, my sister, who if I remember now would have been, right around 48 or 49 when she passed away of cancer, more and more who are experiencing and becoming aware of that at what I still want to believe is a relatively young age. So again, cancer is the leading cause of death, followed by heart disease. One of the things that does happen during middle adulthood, that there are some noticeable, visible changes. Now, most of these do not affect daily functioning at all. These changes tend to affect women more than men. Real quickly, what are some of the visible changes? And again, these are changes that have virtually no effect on daily functioning. But they are clearly noticeable. And they tend to be what labels people or begins to put people in those categories of middle adulthood.
It might be like a decrease in bone mass.
Yeah, but those may not be very as visible decrease in bone mass. They're clearly occurring, but whether people outside of that would actually see those or not, it would be hard to detect. Wrinkles, and again, all of a sudden you begin to see lines and wrinkles and shifts in skin, particularly on the face, and I've noticed that in terms of under my own eyes at different times. But wrinkles clearly are one of the visible characteristics. What else? Huh? Gray hair. I kid my wife a lot about it, but she's been having graying hair really since she started to move into her 40s, and now it's really gray, and she's still what I consider relatively young, but because of the graying hair, looks a little bit older. What else? Now, I can't believe no one's mentioned it yet. Or you're being kind as a group. Thinning hair, balding in the back. And that's one of the things. And again, for many, it starts to occur. And again, for me, it's been clearly an evolutionary kind of process. But when you start to begin to comb it and there's no part, there's nothing to part, and it's kind of fun. And I can laugh about it because it's never really bothered me because I've just accepted it, But it's funny when you go to when I go to get my hair cut, and I still have a good bit of hair on the side and it kind of fills in, but at the top it doesn't change a whole lot. And when they try to kind of comb through it and trim the top where there really isn't, a whole lot there. But again, there are the physical change. I mean, the thinning of the hair, going bald to certain extent. Again, there are but none of those are things that affect, daily function at all. But they clearly are the indicators of the aging process. Now, why would those physical visible changes affect women more than men? It could be hormonal changes, but I'm not sure. I think it may be something else. And I think it may be more social image than anything else. And what is that? Clearly, part of it is the perception and the image in our society that young is beautiful and it's important to look young. And we spend billions and billions of dollars on trying to continue to look young. But why would that affect women more than men? And again, we're seeing more and more men who are spending lots of money to stay young as well. I think women have been doing it for a longer period of time. Any differences in society's image in terms of aging for men and women? Men, older men tend to like younger women. That's probably true. Looking women, yeah, exactly. And some of it gets tied into the sense of, of still feeling attractive and appealing and those kinds of things. And it tends to be more addressed towards younger. How do we tend to look at women as they age? What are some of the stereotypes we tend to have? Nobody knows or afraid to say? Do we tend to have positive kinds of images of females as they age? What about men?
Encouragement to mature and having gained experience and power and things like that, that's the things.
We tend to image men who are getting older very, very differently. And one of the things you said is we often talk about it in terms of maturity. And then we also use some other terms in terms of wisdom. Experience brings wisdom and knowledge. And so a lot of times we'll look at a male as he's getting older and we'll use a term like distinguished. We tend to have more positive kinds of image of males getting older. Now, do we talk about women as being distinguished? What are the terms that we tend to use? We tend to have somewhat more negative, and nobody probably wants to say anything out loud, but we tend to have more derogatory, kind of somewhat more negative kinds of images, for women as they're getting older, And so we may refer to someone as an old hag, or other kinds of negative images, where men we tend to allow them to age and for that aging in some ways to be a positive. But for women, we tend to image that somewhat more negative. And I think women internalize that differently, and there's a much greater desire to want to stay young and stay young as long as they can. Now, I don't think any of those labels are fair, but they do still tend to exist with the emphasis that we tend to put on youth, and physical attractiveness. And clearly those physical changes mark changes in some of that. And others are affected by it more than others. Looking at, again, many of these are a continuation. Of what we begin to see occurring in later young adulthood. But again, remember in late young adulthood, there are ways that young adults tend to compensate for it. And so it doesn't, there's not major adjustments that need to take place. Probably for me, I think what really marked for me in terms of really accepting the reality that I was getting older and that there was physiological changes had to do with eyesight. After about age 40, and it was almost to the year, right around 40, 41, I don't remember the exact year, I became keenly aware of my changing ability to see close objects. and so which is is farsightedness. And I remember finally breaking down and having to go see an eye doctor and getting my first set of glasses, prescription glasses. Because again, younger than 40, literally what I did was I adjusted. I held things further away. When I was working on the computer, I could, didn't really have a lot of problem with the computer, but I could always put something in a little bit bigger font if I needed to, those kinds of things. And so, I really never thought a whole lot about it. And then finally, I remember, and like I said, I was right around 40, 41. I picked up a magazine and I could not read it. If I held it far enough away to where the things came into focus, it was still too far away to recognize the words. And then I really had to accept the fact that my eyesight really was changing, and I no longer could make, kind of typical adjustments, and that it was becoming problematic. Because I was finding myself in places where I couldn't read things that I needed to be able to read. And so I got my first set of glasses. And for me, that was the first realization of really the onset of middle adulthood, And early on, it was also still problematic in the sense that I only needed them to read. I mean, other than just simply reading and reading small print was the only time I needed the glasses. So a lot of times I didn't have my glasses with me, and, because I only needed them at those times. And so I'd leave them set in some place and then all of a sudden find myself needing them and then not having them. And I realized that this was not going to be something that was going to stop. I got them just this year. So this is my second pair. And so we had to boost them up because all of a sudden, and that was, was having to make that adjustment it was kind of frustrating that all of a sudden with glasses I couldn't read text, really small text. And so again, and as I talked with my eye doctor, he said that's not uncommon. That's going to occur for still a number of years, and then at some point it stabilizes and then doesn't change much anymore. And so again, this year I'm on my second set of glasses. I still don't have difficulty with distances. I do fine with distances. I just have more difficulty. And now the biggest problem that I have is when literally I take them off, things go blurry. And so, words clearly are blurry. Even if I sit down to dinner and I've had my glasses on, I take them off, even food looks blurry for a while until my eyes start to readjust. But with the glasses, I have no problem seeing. I have no difficulty functioning at all. I still can drive without glasses. But that's probably one of the more noticeable physical changes that happens typically for many during middle adulthood. And I'm also very much aware of not really the dim light, or at least if it is a situation I don't know so much. Many experience declining ability to see in the dim light and increased sensitivity to glare. That's the one that I'm very much aware of. And again, has occurred somewhere in my 40s. Like I said, the dim light, I haven't noticed that much, and probably I've just simply have adjusted to it. But I have a lot of trouble in really bright sunlight. And I spend a lot of time at the lake, around the water, and the sun reflecting on the water really bothers my eyes a lot. And so I have to wear sunglasses a great deal. And I don't have subscription sunglasses. I probably would benefit from those. But I really do notice the sensitivity of my eyes to the sunlight that I didn't experience when I was younger. And it's funny because you don't realize that, and I'm always asking my son, do you want some sunglasses? And what do I need sunglasses for? Because it doesn't bother him. And because it bothers me so much, I just assume it must bother others sometimes in the same way. So, again, difficulty seeing, change in the difficulty of seeing near objects. Many will experience some difficulty with dim lights, and then as well as sensitivity to glare. And again, we'll see for many this could continue to be a progression up into later adulthood as well. We mentioned this one as probably the most noticeable physiological change in young adulthood, and this continues to decline into middle adulthood as well. Decline in hearing, particularly for high-pitched sounds. As we already mentioned earlier, males show this decrease earlier and faster than females do. Again, there are probably very, very few middle-aged adults that actually it declines or deteriorates to the point where there's a need for hearing aids. Clearly what we do is we simply compensate and adjust to it. I'm sure one of the things that happens is I probably talk louder than I probably need to or that others need me to, and I'm not aware of it personally because it sounds normal to me in terms of my hearing. I know clearly I adjust by turning the TV up, I turn the radio up louder, And I'll notice when others come into the room, then they almost immediately will make some comment about it or begin to turn it down, if I'm not present. Again, you turn it up, you adjust to it, and the volume all sounds normal. And so you don't equate that with changes in ability to hear, And now whether that will actually continue in my case to decline to the point where I'll need other devices or not, that's really hard to tell at this point. For many, there is a decline, or at least for some, a decline in sensitivity and the number of taste buds. Again, I think this is one of those things that, unless something was brought to your attention, you would never even think about this occurring. For a long time, I blamed it on my wife's cooking. I really did. My wife would say, well, how was the meal? And my comment would be, well, it was fine. It just didn't seem to have a lot of flavor. And she would say, well, I put all these seasonings in it, and literally I couldn't taste them. Everything tended to kind of taste rather bland, And I think what I've come to terms with is there's just some shifts and some changes, And so it just simply takes more seasoning, I think, today for me for food to have a real distinct taste to it. And again, like I tell her, it doesn't taste bad, just doesn't have a lot of taste or flavor, flavor to it. With that. And I've actually come to terms now that it's probably not my wife's cooking that's bad as much as it is just some shifts, again, in terms of my sensitivity to taste and what's occurring. All right, I think we'll stop here, and then we'll pick up on some other aspects of physical development next time.